There is a muscle that begins disappearing decades before most people realize it's gone. Not because of age, not because of injury, not because of anything dramatic enough to explain what happens next. It disappears because it stopped being called. And once it goes quiet, once the signal stops arriving consistently enough for the body to keep it ready, everyday life starts changing in ways that seem completely unrelated at first. The stairs that feel slightly longer than they used to, the chair that requires just a little more negotiation to get out of, the parking lot walk that leaves you more aware of your own breathing than you expected to be. Small things, ordinary things, things you filed away under the only explanation that seemed available, getting older. But here is what 24 years of clinical work taught me. That explanation is not wrong, it's just incomplete. And the part that's missing, the part almost nobody ever tells you about, is the difference between a muscle that is gone and a muscle that is simply waiting. Those are not the same thing, and the distance between them may determine how independently you live over the next decade. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I'm a physician specializing in longevity and healthy aging. I didn't create this channel to give you a program. I created it because of what I watched happen to my mother, and because I believe that most people sitting exactly where you're sitting right now, are accepting a version of decline that was never fully theirs to accept. What I'm going to tell you today won't reverse the years, but it will change something more useful than that. It will change how you understand what's actually happening inside the body you're living in right now. And that shift, that one shift in understanding, is where everything that still matters begins. Stay with me. The strange thing is that the body is constantly making decisions about what to keep and what to let go, quietly, without asking, based entirely on one thing: what you've been asking of it lately. I want to tell you about a patient. I'll call him Richard, 69 years old, retired engineer, the kind of man who spent 4 decades solving problems before most people had finished reading them. Precise, observant, not someone who missed things. He walked every morning, 30 minutes, same route, same pace. He gardened on weekends. He drove himself everywhere, managed his own house, carried his own groceries. By every reasonable measure, Richard was doing fine. And then one afternoon, on a completely ordinary stretch of sidewalk, in completely ordinary shoes, on a day with nothing remarkable about it whatsoever, he stumbled. Not a fall, a stumble. The kind that happens to everyone. The foot catches something, a crack, a raised edge, nothing dramatic, and the body responds. Except this time, the response wasn't automatic. There was a pause, not long, a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that nobody standing nearby would have noticed or remembered. But Richard noticed, because in that fraction of a second, something that should have been instant, the correction, the catch, the recovery, had to be found instead of simply happening. He steadied himself, stood there for a moment on that sidewalk, looked around to see if anyone had seen. Nobody had. He kept walking, but he didn't stop thinking about it. Not that afternoon, not that evening, not over the following week, when he found himself, and he only noticed this later, paying slightly more attention to the ground in front of him than he used to, checking surfaces before he stepped onto them, slowing down slightly on anything that wasn't perfectly flat, choosing the longer route around the park because it avoided the section near the east gate where the pavement was uneven. Small adjustments, reasonable adjustments, the kind a careful person makes. 3 weeks later, he was sitting across from me in my office. He didn't mention the stumble right away. He talked about his knee first, a general stiffness, nothing specific. It was only when I asked him, directly, the way I've learned to ask, whether anything had happened recently that made him feel less certain in his body than he used to, that he told me about the sidewalk, about the pause, about the week of paying attention to the ground. And then he said something I've thought about many times since. It wasn't the stumble that scared me. It was that I didn't trust myself to catch it. That sentence stayed with me, because it named something I had watched happen in dozens of patients, something that almost never gets named. It wasn't his strength that had changed. It wasn't his balance, exactly. It wasn't anything a standard physical exam would have caught. What had changed was something quieter than all of those things. The automatic confidence between his body and the world it was moving through. The trust. Here's what I told Richard that afternoon. I told him that what he experienced on that sidewalk had very little to do with his age, and everything to do with a kind of muscle fiber most people never think about until the moment they needed it and felt it hesitate. The fibers responsible for power, for reaction, for the instant response that catches you before your mind has finished forming the thought. Not the muscles that carry you through a long walk, the muscles that respond to surprise. And those fibers, Richard's fibers, your fibers, the fibers in every body over 60 that has spent years moving through a smooth and careful and perfectly predictable daily life. Those fibers don't disappear, they wait. They step back when life stops asking for them. They quiet down when the signals stop arriving. They become, over months and years of reasonable caution and comfortable routine. Available but not ready. Present but not listening. And what Richard needed to understand, what I think you need to understand, is that a fiber that has stepped back is not the same as a fiber that is gone. That distinction is everything, because gone means finished, but waiting means the conversation is still open. Richard came back to see me 2 weeks after that first appointment. He sat down the same way he always did, carefully, the way people sit when they've started paying attention to how they sit. And before I could ask him anything, he said something that surprised me. Not because it was unusual, because I had heard it before, many times, from men and women who were nothing like each other on the surface, and exactly alike in this one particular way. He said, "I think I've been making myself smaller." He didn't mean it physically. He meant the routes he'd been taking, the decisions he'd been making without quite deciding, the way a life, when it starts to feel uncertain in the body, begins to quietly edit itself down. The uneven pavement avoided, the stairs taken more slowly, one hand always available for the railing, the seat at the restaurant chosen not for the view, but for how close it was to the door, the invitation to his grandson's soccer game. Accepted, but with a mental note about the parking, the distance from the car to the field, whether the bleachers had a railing. None of these were dramatic decisions. None of them felt like fear. They felt like wisdom, like the natural, sensible adjustments of a man who had lived long enough to know that falls happen, that recovery takes longer now, that there is nothing wrong with being careful. And he was right. There is nothing wrong with being careful. But there is something worth understanding about what careful becomes when it runs on its own long enough. The nervous system learns. That's one of its greatest strengths. And sometimes, in situations like Richard's, one of its most consequential complications. Every time we avoid a movement because we're uncertain, every time we choose the smoother path because the uneven one feels like a risk, the nervous system takes note. It files that information carefully, efficiently, the way it files everything. And the next time that situation arrives, it offers the same solution it offered before. Caution, hesitation, the quiet internal suggestion that perhaps you should slow down here, check the surface, find something to hold. This is not weakness. This is the body doing precisely what it was designed to do, protecting you based on the most recent information it has. The problem is that the most recent information is incomplete, because the body doesn't know what you're still capable of. It only knows what you've been asking of it lately. And Richard, without realizing it, had been asking for less. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think this is the part of the conversation that most people never have, not with their doctors, not with their families, not even with themselves. The adjustments Richard was making, the careful routes, the chosen seats, the mental calculations before every outing, they weren't just physical adaptations. They were changing something harder to measure, his sense of himself in the world. There is a particular kind of confidence that lives in the body, not the confidence of achievement, not the confidence of knowing you're right about something, the confidence of trusting that your body will do what you ask of it, that when you step off a curb, the ankle will respond, that when you reach for something, the balance will hold, that when the ground shifts slightly beneath you, the body will find its footing without requiring your full, conscious attention to do it. Most people don't notice this confidence when it's present. It operates invisibly, the way good health always does. But when it begins to soften, you notice. Not always in words. Sometimes just in the way a morning feels different than it used to, in the way you arrive somewhere and realize you spent the entire journey thinking about the journey instead of thinking about where you were going. Richard noticed it in the parking calculations, in the fact that a simple afternoon had started to require a kind of advance planning it never used to require. In the distance, quiet, growing, never announced, between the man he had always been and the man he was becoming without ever deciding to. He looked at me across the desk that second appointment and asked the question I had been waiting for him to ask. Is this just what happens now? And I told him the truth. Some of it, yes. The years change things. Recovery changes. Reaction time changes. There are real biological shifts that happen in every body that has lived long enough, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But the stumble on the sidewalk, the pause in the recovery, the routes getting shorter, and the calculations getting longer, that part wasn't age. That part was a conversation that had gone quiet, between Richard and his body, between demand and response, between a nervous system waiting for a signal and a life that had stopped sending one. And here is what I've learned, across 24 years of sitting with people at exactly this moment. The conversation doesn't end because the body gave up. It goes quiet because life got smooth enough that nobody needed to keep having it, because the pavement was avoided, because the uneven path was skipped, because careful became the permanent setting instead of the occasional one. The body, which responds to what you ask of it, had simply begun preparing for a life that asked less of it every season. And the most important thing I could tell Richard, the thing I want to tell you right now, is that a conversation that has gone quiet is not the same as a conversation that is over. Quiet can be broken. The signal can return. And when it does, when the body begins receiving consistent, repeated, believable evidence that it is still needed, it responds. Not the way it responded at 40. I will never promise you that, but meaningfully, functionally, in ways that change what a Tuesday afternoon feels like, in ways that change whether the parking lot is a calculation or just a parking lot. I want to tell you about a moment I've never forgotten, not a patient, not a clinical observation, my own. I was 53 years old, running late for a connecting flight, Atlanta Airport, Concourse E. Anyone who has been through Atlanta knows what that means. I had 12 minutes. Gate was at the far end, and somewhere between the escalator and the moving walkway, in the middle of a crowd of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. I made a decision I didn't fully register making. I stepped off the moving walkway, moved to the side, let the crowd continue past me, and walked, not slowly, but not running either. I told myself it was because of my bag, because of the crowd, because running through an airport at 53 isn't dignified. I missed the flight, sat in a plastic chair at gate E14 for 2 hours waiting for the next one, drank bad coffee, answered emails, and tried not to think about the fact that 3 years earlier, without a second thought, I would have run. I didn't tell anyone about that airport, not my colleagues, not my husband, not the friend I was flying to see, because it didn't feel like a story worth telling. It felt like information, private, slightly uncomfortable information, about the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming, without ever sitting down and deciding to become her. I think about that airport sometimes when a patient sits across from me and describes something they've stopped doing, not dramatically stopped, quietly stopped. The morning swim they keep meaning to get back to. The hiking trail they drove past last October and told themselves, next spring. The dance class a friend mentioned twice, that they haven't said yes to, and haven't quite said no to either, just haven't. There is a particular kind of loss that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a diagnosis. It doesn't come with a conversation you remember having. It accumulates in the space between what you used to do and what you do now, in the small, sensible, entirely reasonable decisions that add up over seasons to a life that has been quietly edited. I've watched it happen in my patients. I watched it happen in my mother. And on a Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta, I watched it begin to happen in me. Her name was Gloria, 71 years old when I first met her, former high school principal. A woman who had spent 30 years walking the length of a school building 12 times a day, without once thinking of it as exercise. She came to see me because her daughter had insisted, not because Gloria thought anything was wrong, but because her daughter had noticed something. The way daughters notice things that mothers have stopped seeing in themselves. She had stopped going to the farmer's market. Every Saturday morning for 20 years, Gloria had walked 6 blocks to the market near her house, bought whatever looked good, talked to the vendors she had known for a decade, walked home, simple, ordinary, hers. And then one Saturday, she hadn't gone, and then another, and by the time her daughter asked about it, Gloria couldn't quite remember when the last time was. She said the walk had started to feel like more than she wanted to deal with on a Saturday morning. Not impossible, just more than she wanted. I asked her what had changed. She thought about it for a long time, the way people think about things they've been carefully not thinking about. Then she said, "I'm not sure anything changed. I think I just stopped believing it was worth the effort." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. Not the farmer's market, not the 6 blocks. I stopped believing it was worth the effort, because in my experience, after 24 years of sitting across from people navigating this, that sentence is rarely about the thing it appears to be about. It's not about effort. It's not about distance. It's not even really about the farmer's market. It's about a quiet erosion of expectation. The body starts to feel less reliable. The world starts to feel like it requires more negotiation than it used to. And somewhere in that recalibration, without a decision being made, without a conversation being had, the things that used to feel worth doing start to feel like they require justification. And things that require justification have a way of not getting done. Gloria's fast-twitch fibers weren't gone. I want to be precise about that. She wasn't frail. She wasn't unsafe. There was nothing in her physical presentation that explained a 6-block walk feeling like more than she wanted. What had changed was something the tests don't capture. The conversation between her body and her expectations of it had quietly shifted. She had stopped asking. The body had stopped preparing, and the Saturday morning market, which had once been simply a Saturday morning, had become, without anyone noticing, something that needed to be decided. That's the moment I watch for now, not the fall, not the diagnosis, not the dramatic event that everyone recognizes as a turning point. The moment when ordinary things start requiring decisions they never used to require. The moment when a 6-block walk needs to be weighed, when a parking lot becomes a calculation, when an afternoon out stops being something you do and becomes something you prepare for. That moment, quiet, invisible, entirely reasonable on the surface, is the moment worth paying attention to, because it is almost never about the 6 blocks. It is about what the 6 blocks used to mean, and what it costs slowly and silently when they start to feel like more than they're worth. What changed for me after Atlanta wasn't dramatic. It happened slowly, over months. I started taking the stairs in my building again, not as exercise, not as a decision I was proud of, just stairs. I started parking farther away, walking through airports instead of around them, choosing the route that asked something of me instead of the one that didn't. Small things, things that shouldn't have required a decision, but had quietly become ones. And what I noticed over weeks and then months was that the decisions started requiring less effort. Not because I trained for anything, not because I followed a program, because the body, which had been waiting for a different signal, had started receiving one. This is the part that surprises people most. Not the loss. People understand loss. They feel it, file it away, move on. What surprises people? What surprised Richard? What surprised Gloria? What surprised me standing in that Atlanta airport? Is how quickly the body responds when you begin asking again. There is a concept in physiology called neuromuscular adaptation. I'm not going to give you a lecture, but I want to give you one idea from it, because this idea, once it lands, changes the way you see the next 10 years. The connection between your nervous system and your muscles is not fixed. It is a relationship, and like most relationships, it responds to attention. When you ask your body for something consistently, repeatedly, in ways that require a genuine response, the nervous system begins to prioritize that connection. The signal gets cleaner, the response gets faster, the gap between intention and action, the gap where Richard's stumble lived, where my moving walkway decision was made, that gap begins to close. Not all the way back, not to 35, but enough. Enough that a staircase stops requiring a conversation with yourself before you take it. Enough that the body starts feeling like something you inhabit rather than something you manage. I've watched this happen in patients in their 60s, in their 70s, in their early 80s, and what stays with me every time is that it almost never required what people assumed it would. Not a gym, not a program, not a dramatic overhaul, just the signal, consistent, repeated, believable enough that the body understood. We're being asked again. Stay ready. Gloria went back to the farmer's market. 6 blocks, a Saturday morning, the same vendors, the same walk home. She told me the first time felt strange, not difficult, strange. The way familiar things feel when you've been away long enough that returning feels like a decision instead of a habit. By the 3rd Saturday, it was a habit again. The body doesn't celebrate when the signal returns. It doesn't announce anything. It simply gets back to work. As if it had been waiting for exactly this, as if it had known all along that the conversation wasn't over, just paused. Let me tell you what the signal actually looks like, not in a laboratory, not in a clinical setting. in a Tuesday morning, in an ordinary kitchen, in the small, unremarkable moments that make up a life. Because I think there's a misunderstanding that happens here. When people hear that the body responds to signal, that the nervous system rebuilds connection when it's consistently asked, the mind goes immediately to the obvious places. The gym, the trainer, the program that starts on Monday and requires equipment and commitment and a version of yourself that feels, honestly, a little exhausting to imagine right now. That's not what I'm talking about. The body doesn't distinguish between a gym and a kitchen. It doesn't know the difference between a formal workout and carrying a basket of laundry up a flight of stairs without putting it down halfway. What it registers is demand, real demand, genuine effort, the honest request of a body being asked to do something that requires it to actually respond. Richard started with his own front steps, 3 steps up from the sidewalk to his front door. He'd been using the railing automatically for so long he couldn't remember when he'd started. One morning, no particular reason, no plan, he went up without it, slowly, both feet on each step, paying attention in a way he hadn't paid attention to 3 steps in years. He told me it felt strange, not hard, strange, like reclaiming something he hadn't realized he'd given away. He did it again the next morning, and the morning after that, not because he'd decided to start a program, because it had started to feel like his again. That's what I mean by signal. Not the number of repetitions, not the resistance level, not any of the metrics that make movement feel like math. The signal is the honest request. The body being asked, clearly, repeatedly, in ways it cannot ignore, to do something real. Here is what I want you to visualize. Think about the moments in an ordinary day where the body is either asked something or quietly excused from it. The stairs at the doctor's office, elevator, or stairs, a decision made before you fully thought about it. The grocery bags from the car, 1 trip or 2, and whether you make that decision based on what's easier or based on what you're actually capable of. The chair at the kitchen table, whether you stand up using your legs or whether your hands have started participating in a way they didn't used to. The parking spot, closest available, or the 1-2 rows back that nobody else wanted. None of these are exercises. None of them require a gym bag or a schedule or a version of yourself you haven't been in 15 years. They are simply moments, ordinary moments where the body is either asked to participate or quietly relieved of the need to. And the accumulation of those moments, across a week, across a month, across a year, is either a body that remains in conversation with the demands of daily life, or a body that has been, with the best of intentions, gradually excused from them. I had a patient, 74 years old, retired librarian, who told me something during our 3rd appointment that I've repeated to colleagues many times since. She said, "I realized I'd been protecting myself from my own life." She didn't mean it dramatically. She meant the stairs she took the elevator past, the bags she let her son carry, the walk she shortened because the longer route had that one uneven section near the corner. Small protections, reasonable protections, the kind that accumulate quietly into a body that has stopped being asked to navigate the actual texture of a real life. The texture matters. This is something I want to say clearly because it gets lost in conversations about aging and movement. The body doesn't just need to move, it needs to move through things. Uneven surfaces, unexpected demands, the slight variation of a sidewalk that isn't perfectly flat, a bag that's heavier than expected, a step that's slightly higher than the last one. These small variations, the ones we spend enormous energy avoiding as life gets more careful, are precisely what keeps the neuromuscular system sharp. They are the questions the nervous system needs to keep answering in order to stay fluent in the language of movement. When we remove them, when life becomes smooth enough that nothing is ever quite unpredictable, the system doesn't stay sharp, waiting for the day they return. It adjusts to their absence. And the day they inevitably return, the uneven parking lot, the unfamiliar staircase, the grandchild who grabs your hand and starts moving faster than you expected. The response is slower than it should be, not because the body failed, because the question hadn't been asked in a long time. Richard told me something at our last appointment that I think about when I'm tempted to overcomplicate this. He said, "I stopped thinking about it as exercise. I started thinking about it as just not making myself smaller, not a program, not a goal, not a before and after. Just a daily decision not to quietly excuse himself from the ordinary demands of his own life. The stairs instead of the elevator, the longer route through the park, the bags carried in one trip because he could, not because someone was watching, not because he was proving anything, but because the body was asking to be asked, and he had decided finally to answer. I want to ask you something directly, not as a physician, not as someone with a file full of clinical observations and 24 years of patients who arrived convinced it was too late. Just as someone who has been in this conversation with you for the last 40 minutes. We've talked about Richard, about Gloria, about an airport in Atlanta and a moving walkway, and the quiet, accumulating cost of a life that starts making itself smaller without anyone deciding it should. We've talked about what the body loses when the signal stops, and what happens, without drama, without announcement, when the signal returns. And now I want to ask the question that all of this was building toward. Not, can your body still respond? That question has been answered by the research, by the patients who sat across from me, certain it was over, and discovered, consistently, that it wasn't. By Richard, who went up his front steps without the railing on an ordinary morning with no particular plan, and felt something return that he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The body can respond, at 60, at 70, at 82, not identically to 40, but meaningfully, functionally, in ways that change what a Tuesday afternoon feels like. That question is answered. The question that isn't answered, the one that only you can answer, is whether you're going to call it. The body doesn't need permission to respond. It needs the request, consistent, repeated, honest enough that the nervous system believes this is the new reality. Not a week of good intentions, not a temporary experiment, but a genuine change in what life is asking of it. That request doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to start on Monday. It doesn't require equipment or a plan or a version of yourself you haven't been in 15 years. The stairs instead of the elevator, the bag carried in one trip, the route with the uneven section near the corner that you've been walking around for 2 years for reasons that, when examined honestly, don't quite hold up. Not because someone told you to, not because you're proving anything to anyone, because the body is waiting. And you now understand, precisely, clearly, what waiting means, and what it costs when the wait goes on too long. If you're still here with me, and I'm genuinely glad you are, subscribe to this channel. Not for the algorithm, but because this conversation, the honest one, the one that doesn't promise miracles or sell you a version of aging that was never real, is a conversation I intend to keep having. Every single day, with you. But before we finish, there is one thing I haven't told you yet. Something I've saved for the end because it requires everything that came before it to land correctly. A misunderstanding about the body and aging that follows people for decades, that followed my mother, that I almost let follow me. And if you leave this conversation with only one idea, only one thing that stays with you after this video ends, I want it to be this. Here is the misunderstanding I want to leave you with, the one that costs people more than any single clinical error I have ever witnessed, more than missed diagnoses, more than delayed treatments, more than anything that shows up in a medical file. Most people, when they begin to feel the body changing, when the stairs take more, when the recovery takes longer, when the stumble on the sidewalk stays in the mind longer than it should, most people believe the goal is to get back to the body they had at 50, back to the ease they remember from 40, back to the version of themselves that didn't have to think about parking lots or staircases or whether a 6-block walk was worth the effort on a Saturday morning. That goal sounds reasonable, it sounds honest, but it is the wrong goal. The body you had at 40 is not coming back. I could soften that. I could find a gentler way to say it. But I think you've spent enough time in this conversation with me to know that gentle isn't always the same as honest. The body at 40 is not coming back, and the pursuit of it, the quiet, exhausting, never quite satisfied pursuit of a body that belongs to a chapter already written, is one of the most effective ways I know to miss the body you actually have. The one that is here, right now, still responsive, still capable of more than it has been asked for lately, still waiting, patiently, without resentment, to be called back into a life that needs it. I think about my mother, Margaret, who started making her world smaller at 71 because the body she had was no longer the body she remembered, and she didn't know what to do with the distance between them. She had simply stopped believing that the body she had was worth asking anything of, and so she asked less, and it gave less, and the world got smaller. And 5 years later, she left it from inside a life that had shrunk to fit what she had decided she was still allowed to want. I couldn't save those 5 years, but I have spent 24 years trying to understand what might have. What my mother needed, what Richard needed on that sidewalk, what Gloria needed on a Saturday morning, 6 blocks from a market she had stopped believing was worth walking to, was not a younger body. It was permission to inhabit the one she had. Fully, without apology. Without the constant comparison to a version of herself that no longer existed and never needed to. The goal was never to become younger. The goal was never to return to 40. The goal, the only one the body can actually help you reach, is to remain fully present inside the life you still have. Not the life you had. Not the life you're afraid of having. The one you're in right now. Presence is not a consolation prize. It is what the body was always for. The ability to be where you are, to show up for the people who need you there, to chase a grandchild across a backyard, not because you're proving something, but because the moment is happening and your body can still take you there if you ask it. That's what this channel is. Not a program, not a promise. Not a before and after. A daily reminder that the conversation is still open, that the body is still listening, that the life you are living right now, with its real limitations, its real losses, its real evidence that the years have passed, is still worth showing up for, fully, in the body you have. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I'll be here tomorrow. I hope you will be too.